purpose of today's training is to defeat yesterday's understanding. Miyamoto Musashi. It can be easy to think that there's nothing left to learn from a legacy format, but that couldn't be further from the truth. There's only so many hours in the day, though, so how do we make sure we're spending our time wisely? Welcome back to Goat Duels. I'm InfusionsCap, and today I want to bring you 5 tips for getting the most out of your playtesting. Tip number 1. Where to begin. Like any good story, we start at the beginning. Whether you have experience in GOAT format, are new to GOAT format, or completely new to Yu-Gi-Oh! As a whole, every time you hit the New Deck button in the deck editor, you get a blank slate, and there's a couple of ways to go about choosing the 55 cards you want to combine into your new deck. Perhaps you build a version of a meta deck from scratch, or build something rogue on your own. Maybe you saw a deck list online that just won a tournament, and you like it and you want to try it out. Any of these are valid approaches, and there's nothing wrong with net decking. But the important thing to remember is that this is now your deck. There's nothing set in stone saying you can't make changes from a deck you copied from a tournament. It's important to play in a style that is comfortable to you. Whatever you choose as your starting point, make sure you're willing to test the deck out and make changes as you go. Just because a specific list won a tournament doesn't mean you'll win every game with it, and it doesn't even necessarily mean you'll win over half of your games with that list. Many of the deck lists we see winning tournaments are succeeding because a lot of time, effort, and testing went into those choices, but also because those choices were made in anticipation of the expected meta for that event. The meta is always rotating even in a legacy format like this, so experimenting, making changes, and testing those adjustments is critical to the process. Tip number 2. Look at the cards in question. After you have your deck and you're ready to play some games with it, make sure to take note of critical junctures in those early duels. Maybe you actually want to write notes, or maybe you have a really good memory and don't have to do that, or perhaps you're playing online and can just access replays. The way you go about this is not as important as the act of doing it. Let's say, for example, you're working with a deck that just won an event, and the list has 3 copies of Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer in the main deck, but you find yourself getting flooded with Kaiku all the time in your games, and you want to consider going down to 2. Whether or not you make this change will depend on a number of factors, such as matchup viability for Kaiku. How often do you anticipate seeing the decks that Kaiku is strong against? Even if you see them often, is 3 worth it or is it overkill? Would Kaiku be better as a side deck card? Is it performing extra poorly in matchups where it isn't strong because of the deck you're playing? Lots of things to consider. These factors can't be analyzed over a single game. You need multiple games against multiple different archetypes to get a good sample size. The more information you gather, the easier it is to guide your line of thinking to the correct decision. So play as much as you can and make sure to take note of which cards are over and underperforming in various matchups. It can be hard to get that many hands in though, which brings us to the next tip. Tip number 3. Get a dedicated testing group. This is one of the more difficult steps in the process because it's the only one that requires you to rely on someone other than yourself, but there are a couple of ways to go about it. I'm very fortunate in that my dedicated testing group is my team, my same group of friends that I've played Yu-Gi-Oh! With since 2005. If you don't have a group like this, however, you can always try to build one with people from your local game store if you have that option available, or maybe you will want to consider making some friends online in the dueling community. The Goat Duels Discord and the Goat Format Discord channels are really great resources for this. Dedicated testing groups allow for opportunities that simply playing online cannot provide. 2 heads are always better than 1. 3 heads are better still. It's always helpful to be able to bounce ideas off of others, and to get help trying those ideas out. There are only so many hours in the day, after all. Dedicated testing groups also give you the opportunity to run specific matchups at any time, whereas playing the ladder alone will yield a random matchup every time. If you're looking to focus in on a specific aspect of the deck as it pertains to a certain matchup, then you'll need to test that matchup. And having a dedicated group is a solid way to do this. One thing to note, a dedicated testing group can't be the catch-all, however. You still need to test against random matchups and random opponents as well, because on a long enough timeline, your testing group will begin to metagame against each other and subconsciously ignore the bigger picture if you aren't careful. So dedicated groups need to be used in conjunction with games with people outside of your group, which brings us to the next tip. Tip number 4, test on the ladder. Once you've worked on your deck with your testing group, make sure you're continuing to play games on the ladder or in-person games against people outside of your group at your local game store. Not only will this prevent you from getting tunnel vision on the approaches your teammates are using, it will bring the element of surprise back into your games from both sides, because you won't know what your opponent is playing, and they won't know what you're playing until the game is underway. This is especially critical for making sure your deck has strong starts when you're going in blind. During focus testing with a playgroup where you know the matchup, it can be easy to play with guilty knowledge and make opening moves that are tilted against the specific matchup, even though they wouldn't be your normal opening lines against other decks. While testing specific matchups is important and is critical for refining side deck strategies, you have to remember that you won't always have that knowledge at the start of the match, so you have to be able to adapt to the unknown and play good openings. Now for the last tip. Tip number 5. Analyze the aftermath. This is harder to do for paper games unless you are taking really good notes, but for online games it's much easier because you can view the replays. This is important to do, especially for games where you lose. It's easy to assume that it was bad luck and there was nothing you could have done differently, but is that true? Do you even know for sure? It's important to take an honest look and admit when you make mistakes, otherwise you can't really learn from them. You can't grow from lying to yourself. You can't harness a lesson to help you in the future by sugarcoating a loss to feel better about it in the moment. It's critical to get over this pitfall, otherwise your losses are simply losses for no reason and nothing can be gained from them. It's important to know if these losses were the result of poor play, or if it could have been prevented with a deck building change. Sometimes it is luck. This is a card game after all, and variance does exist. But before you chalk it up to a bad beat, make sure you analyze the black box on the wreckage and see if there was another line you could have taken, or if a deck building choice forced you into a bad spot that you didn't have to be in. I know this takes time and isn't always pleasant to do, but I promise you, you'll be better off for the extra effort. To quickly recap, find decks and strategies that appeal to you, but if you net deck, be willing to experiment and make changes to make that deck your own. Keep an eye out for non-staple cards with questionable quantities. Track how well or how poorly they're performing in your games and make adjustments accordingly. Don't be afraid to go against the grain and challenge the notion of what a staple actually is. Get a dedicated testing group. Whether it's a group of friends or people at your local paper events, it's important to be able to bounce ideas off of other people. Make sure you're continuing to test online and follow this process in games against players where you aren't familiar with what they're playing to bring the element of surprise back into the mix. And finally, make sure you're watching replays, especially of games where you lost, to learn from those mistakes and further validate the data you've gathered from your testing. That's it for this video. If you found this information helpful, please make sure to like and subscribe for more Goat Duels content. And until next time, duel well and duel often.